So, as a pre-warning, just before we start chapter 10, we've got a bit of a flu, so we're hacking, coughing, sniffling and sneezing, so in advance, soz for that.
Okay, let's get into it. Chapter 10. There was a hint of light in the eastern sky, or was it my imagination? I'd looked for dawn so many times already, but with no satisfaction. Homer was asleep on my left, mouth open, snoring slightly. My eyes felt heavy and dull, as though they would look glazed and opaque to anyone staring into them. Luckily, no one was staring into them. I looked around listlessly. A faint breeze tickled the leaves of the trees, made them move and whisper and play around. In the bush ahead of me, a branch crackled and fell. It sounded surprisingly loud, though I didn't hear it hit the ground. A large bird, a white owl I think, flapped across the top of the cliff. Then came the unmistakable sound of human footsteps. Only a cow sounds as heavy and purposeful as a human, and there wouldn't be cows in this dense bush. I felt sick with fear and hope. I grabbed Homer by the shoulder. As he stirred into life, I leaned over further and clamped my hand on his mouth. He gurgled a bit, then, as I could tell by the sudden tenseness of his body, he woke. We both sat there waiting, paralysed. We couldn't move without making a lot of noise, and the footsteps kept coming. They were accelerating. I stood, crouching to be ready. I could see a figure weaving through the trees. It was Fee. I held my arms out, but she didn't even look at me. "They're following me," she said. There was a horrible sick pause. Then Homer asked quickly, "How many?" "I don't know. It might only be one. I'm sorry." We turned our ears back to the bush and immediately heard footsteps, lighter than Fee's, less certain, less purposeful. "I'm sorry," said Fee again. "I've been trying for ages." Her voice sounded thick and dead, with no emotion. She was all in. I squeezed her arm quickly. Homer had picked up a hunk of wood. I wished now that he had his sawn-off shotgun. I looked around for a weapon. There wasn't a lot of choices. I got a rock, about the size of a baseball, and gave it to Fee. But I don't think she registered what it was for. She just held it loosely, without lifting her arm. I got myself a rock too. None of us were sure what to do. We were just acting instinctively, but instinctively we looked for weapons. We could have scattered and run, but with the cliffs behind us and thick bush in front, there weren't too many options. And one look at Fee made it clear we'd have to stand and fight. She was leaning against a tree, the one we would use as our ladder back up the hill. Fee's head was down, but she kept holding the rock. As I glanced at her, she suddenly retched and vomited. The sound attracted her pursuer. I heard the footsteps accelerate a little. Whoever it was came straight at us now, with more confidence. I looked for Homer, but he had vanished, though I could guess which tree he was behind. I ducked behind another one. I saw the shadowy figure of a soldier slipping between the trees, just 10 metres from me. Only one soldier. I couldn't hear any others. He had seen Fee and was going straight for her. His rifle was over his shoulder still. It must have been obvious that Fee wasn't going to give him a fight, and I think he had more in his mind than just capturing her. He moved in quickly, like a fox on a lambing ewe. He wasn't a big man, a boy really, probably about our age, and with Chris's slim build. He was hatless and dressed in a light uniform, summer gear rather than autumn or winter. He didn't seem to have anything with him but his rifle. As he went eagerly towards Fee, I came out from my tree and followed him. I felt full of wild terror. I still didn't know what I was going to do. I couldn't believe what I was going to do. I was gripping my rock, but I noticed that Fee's had fallen to the ground. The man was only 10 steps from Fee. I was right behind him, but I couldn't bring myself to act. It was as though I was waiting for something to trigger me off, something to force me to do more than follow him helplessly. Then he provided the trigger himself. He must have heard me because he suddenly started swinging around, raising his hand as he did so. I saw his eyes starting to widen with terror, and I felt my eyes reflect his. I raised my arm, and as though in a dream, I began to bring it down on his head. I had a strange, quick memory flash, a horror story I'd been told about how a murder victim retains the image of... I had a strange, quick memory flash, a horror story. I'd been told about how a murder victim retains the image of his murderer on his retina. To look into a corpse's eyes while looking at a photo of to look into a corpse's eyes was like looking at a photo of its killer. I was bringing my arm down, thinking about that. Then I realised I wasn't hitting with enough force, and at the last moment struck harder. The soldier got his arm up enough to deflect and soften the blow, but the rock still hit him pretty hard on the side of the head. My arm jarred badly, but luckily I didn't drop the rock. The man took a swing at me, and I ducked, but I got a stinging smack on the side of the head, which made me go numb a bit. I saw his dark, sweaty face. His eyes looked half closed, and I wasn't sure why, but I thought maybe I'd hurt him more than I'd realised. I poked at his face with the hand holding the rock, but he pushed my hand away. Then there was a rush of feet behind him. For a second or so that we'd been fighting, I'd completely forgotten about Homer. Amazingly, the man swung around fast and swerved his head away. Homer was taking an almighty swing at him with a branch, but missed his head and got him on the shoulder instead. The man staggered at the knees and lost his balance. At that moment I lifted the rock with both hands and brought it down on his head, hard. There was a terrible dull thud, like hitting a tree with the back of an axe. The man's eyes rolled up in his head, and with a funny little snoring noise he dropped to the ground, as though praying, kneeling. And with his head bowed, then he fell to the ground, sideways, and lay there. I gazed at him, horrified for a moment, before throwing the rock away, as though it were contaminated. I ran to Fee and grabbed her by the shoulders. I don't know what I wanted from her, but I didn't get it. She just stared into my eyes like she couldn't remember who I was. Then I realised the man could wake up again at any moment. I shook my head hard to try and get some sense back into it, and went back to him. Homer had his back turned and face pressed into a tree, having his own private meeting with the devil. I bent over the soldier, not knowing whether to hope he was dead or hope he was alive. He was alive, breathing very slowly, with deep shuddering groans. There was a long pause between each breath. He sounded terrible. I realised then it would have been better for us if he was dead, though I was shocked at myself for thinking that. I pulled his rifle off him and threw it a few metres away. Almost immediately I heard another lot of footsteps coming through the trees, quite brisk and sure. I slid across the ground and grabbed the rifle again, trying to cock it, but it was an automatic one, too complicated to work out. I held it up desperately as though pointing at someone magically protect me, but it was Robin, who was walking towards me, looking as calm as ever, until she saw the weapon. "Ellie, don't shoot me!" I lowered it. "Where'd you get that thing?" "Over there," I said, pointing, getting the shakes a bit, but putting the rifle down carefully. Robin seemed so controlled, and I felt like I was on the brink of completely losing control. Robin lost her smile suddenly. She ran to the soldier and knelt beside him. "What happened? Did you shoot him?" "I hit him with a rock and a branch. God, I think he's pretty bad. He has to die, Robin," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If he doesn't, he'll get his friends and they'll come looking for us. And the first thing they'll do is to climb that tree. They could track us right home, into hell." She didn't answer, but left the soldier and went to Fee. "Are you all right?" she asked. Fee stared at her too for a moment, as she had at me. Fee stared at her too for a moment, as she had at me. Then she nodded. I was relieved that she was at least functioning that much again. "Has anyone seen Lee?" "No," said Fee. I explained how Homer and I had gone back to the firebreak, but hadn't spent much time searching the bush for him. "I'm rapt to find you," Robin said. "It was just a sudden brainwave to come here. If you hadn't been here, I don't know what I would have done. I didn't have any other ideas." She paused for a few seconds, as if thinking of something. Then she took charge. "Come on, guys," she said. "You can have your nervous breakdowns later, like I'm going to have mine, for calling out at the men on the road, but you can't have them now. I'm not being funny about this. We simply have to keep ourselves together if we're going to make it." "What happened back at the camp?" I asked. As Robin was talking, we gradually moved in together, into a huddle around the inconspicuous young soldier, who was still lying on the ground, breathing his slow breaths. "It was a disaster," she said. Fee and I didn't get there in time. We'd been lost for nearly an hour. Then we saw them at last, through the trees. We were so close to it, we could actually see the tents. I still can't believe how it happened. Then this firing suddenly started all around us. It was so loud, like standing in the middle of a whole lot of construction workers with jackhammers. A soldier stood up right in front of us and started firing. We could have taken one step forward and touched him. It was a miracle he didn't hear us. Hey, Fee. Fee just nodded, dumbly. Robin was trying to humour her into talking again, but I think she was too physically exhausted, if nothing else. Well, Robin went on, staring at her boots, what can I say? It was horrible, disgusting. Some of the bullets and shells they used were like fireworks. They glowed, they were so bright. And they chucked in a flare or something. The people, they were running in different directions. They didn't know which way to go. It was a massacre. I was backing out fast, so I didn't see much. At least it was so noisy that they couldn't hear me. Not just the gunfire, but the screams. I don't know how many people I've seen killed today. She blinked furiously. Her face seemed to crumble for a moment. Her lips twisted, and she put her knuckle into her mouth, struggling to keep control, until gradually she was able to speak again. But all she said was, anyway, I tried to find Fee, and there was no sign of her. She looked at Fee, inviting her to take over. I think she wanted a spotlight off her for a few minutes. I just ran, Fee whispered. I'm sorry, Robin. I lost my head and ran. After a while, I realised someone was following me. I hoped it was you, but it didn't sound like you. I called out, but there was no answer. They kept coming, so I kept running. I tried to lead them away from here and then lose them, but I couldn't. After a while, I crawled under some blackberries and hid. I waited for hours until finally I thought they must have gone. I hadn't heard them go, but I thought no one could have just sat there waiting in the darkness for all that time. So I came crawling out again, and as soon as I did, someone came running at me. I screamed and ran off. I just kept running around the bush. After a while, I got so tired. Then I hit the cliffs again. I thought I'd better come here. I hope there might be someone here, but I'm sorry I made it so dangerous for you. Doing that, I shouldn't have done that. We all made soothing noises. Of course you should. You did the right thing. That's exactly what I would have done. But I don't know if it had much effect. In the middle of all my own mess of emotions, I shuddered as I thought of the terrifying night Fee had spent, trying to shake off those footsteps in the dark bush, heading at last for the tree, but not knowing if she would find only the silence of the night there, knowing only that she was too tired to go any further, knowing that when she reached the tree she might have to turn and face her death. This had been a terrible night for all of us, but perhaps for Fee most of all. That was assuming Lee was okay. Robin started speaking again. It's still pretty dark. What are we going to do? We've got Lee missing and this guy unconscious, right at the foot of our ladder back to hell. Homer finally started stirring into life again. It was an effort for all of us. We were trying to think normally, to talk normally, but the words seemed to come out slowly, like toothpaste slowly squeezed from its tube. We can wait a bit longer, he said. Put yourselves in their minds. They're not going to be wandering around the bush at this hour, looking for survivors, or even for one of their own people. Too dangerous for them, and they probably think they got everyone anyway. This guy chasing Fee, he was a one-off, I think. What happens? I said. I had to clear my throat and start again. What happens if after another hour or two this guy is still alive? Homer didn't look at me. Hoarsely he said, What you did to that guy back in Buttercup Lane, the one I shot? That was different, I said. I did that because he was going to die anyway. It was euthanasia. Look at this bloke, Homer said. He's not going to live, or if he does, he'll be a vegetable. You don't know that, but I tried to explain the real difference. That was in hot blood, I said at last. I don't think I could do it in cold blood. One of the things I find strangest and hardest is that we were having such conversations. We should have been talking about discos and electronic mail and exams and bands. How could have this been happening to us? How could have we been huddled in the dark bush, cold and hungry and terrified, talking about who we should kill? We had no preparation for this, no background, no knowledge. We didn't know if we were doing the right thing. We didn't know anything. We were just ordinary teenagers, so ordinary we were boring. Overnight they'd pulled the roof off our lives, and after they'd pulled the roof off, they'd come in and torn down the curtains, ripped up the furniture, burnt the house, and thrown us to the night. where we'd been forced to run and hide and live like wild animals. We had no foundations, and we had no secure walls around our lives anymore. We were living in a strange long nightmare, where we had to make our own rules, invent new values, stumble around blindly, hoping we weren't making too many mistakes. We clung to what we knew and what we thought was right, but all the time those things too were being stripped from us. I didn't know if we'd been left with nothing, or if we'd been left with a new set of rules and attitudes and behaviours, so that we weren't able to recognise ourselves anymore. We couldn't end up as new, distorted, deformed creatures with only a few physical resemblance. We could end up as new, distorted, deformed creatures with only a few physical resemblances to the people we once were. Of course, in among all of this we had moments, days sometimes, when we acted in ways that were normal, vaguely like the old days. But it was never the same. Even those moments were wrapped by what had happened to us, by the horrible new world that we'd been forced into. There seemed no end to it, no clues as to what we would become. Nothing. Just day-to-day survival. Homer had leaned over the young soldier on the ground and was going through his pockets. He gradually accumulated a little pile of items as we watched in silence. It was hard to see details in the dark, but there was a wallet and a knife and a couple of keys. Then from a breast pocket he pulled out a little torch, no bigger than a pen. I switched it on. In his light, I saw just how badly hurt the soldier was. There was blood coming out of his ears and nose, and his scalp was matted with blood, so that the hairs of his head were wet and stuck together. I also saw how young he was. He could have been younger than us. His smooth skin looked as if no razor had ever touched it. I had to remind myself urgently, harshly, that he was a potential rapist, a potential killer. At the same time, I knew I couldn't kill him. We could move him a long way off, said Robin doubtfully, so that they wouldn't connect him with the tree and the cliff. And if he wakes up, I asked, we're not doctors. We don't know what might happen. He'd at least have concussion, Robin said, even more doubtfully. He probably wouldn't remember where he was or what happened. No one bothered to point out all the flaws in the plan. We sat there quietly watching. After about an hour, I began to realise that the young soldier was going to solve the problem for us. I realised that his life was slowly ebbing away. He was dying on the ground in front of us. As we looked on without a word being spoken, we made no move to save him, though I doubt we could have if we'd done much anyway. I felt sad. In the short time we'd been gathered around him, I'd come to feel that I knew him, in a strange sort of way. Death seemed so personal, so close. When it came slowly, almost gently, like this, in touching him, it touched us all. Every quarter of an hour or so, Homer switched the torch on. But although it was still dark under the trees, we didn't really need it. I could see each rise and fall of the uniformed chest, could feel each struggle to draw the next breath. I began to hold my own breath as he finished exhaling, willing him to find more air, but gradually each breath became lighter, and the pause between each one longer. A feather resting on his mouth might have fluttered a little as he reached for another moment of life, but the feather would not have lifted at all. It had been a cold night, and it was a cold morning, but for once I didn't feel it. Fee was huddled against me, her face turned away from the soldier, and she helped keep me warm. Every so often she shook with a spasm that might have been caused by the cold. Robin sat beside the soldier's head, watching him calmly. There was something beautiful about her face as she gazed at his. Homer sat behind his head, also watching calmly, but there was a dark shadow on his face, and impatience in the way he bent forward, like a cocked rifle. It made me nervous to see him like that. There was a distant crack through the trees, like the falling branch I'd heard earlier. There'd been noises all night, as there always are in the bush. The yowl of possums, the howl of a feral dog, the wing beating of owls, a breeze through the trees, and mysterious rustles in the undergrowth. I was used to all that, and didn't respond, hardly noticed it, but this was different somehow. And I sat up a little, and turned a little towards it, and then heard the shout. "Ellie! Homer! Are you there?" Wild relief ran through me. "Lee! Over here!" We heard his blundering footsteps, then running and crashing towards us. I stood and moved a few steps in his direction. He came clumsily through the tall trees, squeezing through a narrow gap in front of me. I held out my arms, and he grabbed me and hugged me, but all I could feel were the bones of his body. I didn't feel love or affection or warmth from him, just an ugly roughness, and relief perhaps. He pushed me away and looked around him. Anyone got any food? I'm starving. No, Robin said. Nothing. We've got to get out of here, Lee said. His eyes had passed over the soldier on the ground, but he hadn't shown any surprise. Now he focused on him. What's he doing here? He followed Fee, Homer said. He's still alive? Lee said. He's still alive, Lee said. Yes. Well, what are you waiting for? I wasn't sure what he meant. We were waiting for you, I said. And we didn't know what to do with him, but I think he's close to dying. We've got to go, Lee said. His eyes scanned the ground. Suddenly he bent down and picked up the soldier's knife from the sad little piece of possessions. At first I thought he'd then overbalanced and fallen on the boy. I even gasped and started to say, look out, but I realised at once that it was deliberate. Lee had landed clumsily with his knees on the boy's chest and at the same time had buried a knife in him, aiming at the heart. The boy gave a terrible gasp and both of his hands lifted lightly, with fingers flailing. Homer switched on the torch, and in its sharp focused light, like a scalpel, I saw the face go very white and a rush of blood pour from the mouth as it slowly opened. It stayed open, then something left the face, a spirit or something fled from it, and he was dead. His face became the colour of water, no colour at all. Fee was screaming, but then she took a big gulp and stopped herself, as though she had swallowed the last scream. She put her hand to her mouth and gave a little hiccup. Her eyes were wide, and she was staring at Lee as though he were a monster. Jack the Ripper. I was scared of him myself, wondering if he'd changed forever, if he'd become a devil. Robin was hyperventilating, with her hands to her throat. Homer backed away, eyes staring, his hands behind him as though looking for support. There was no support there. I just stood with my mouth open, looking at the young boy on the ground. Homer had dropped the torch, and I bent down and picked it up. Excuse me again. Lee stood and walked away a couple of steps, then came back. Let's get rid of him, he said, but all the anger and harshness had gone out of his voice. He sounded almost normal, except I didn't know if he'd ever be normal again. We can't bury him, I said, my voice shaking, on the edge of hysteria. There's no time, and we haven't got tools. We'll move him down the gully, Lee said. None of us moved, until Lee shouted at us, Come on, don't just stand there, help me. I took his head, which was amazingly heavy, and Lee picked up the feet. None of the others were in any shape to help. We struggled along with the body, trying to pick a wide enough path through the bush. After we'd covered only 10 metres, I was sweating. I couldn't believe how heavy this light guy was. I was starting to drop him, but then Robin arrived beside me and helped. We'd better not drag him, I said, or they might see the tracks. I was shocked at myself for saying something so cold-blooded, but neither of the others reacted. We limped on, each of us reluctant to be the one to say stop, until somehow we'd reached the head of the gully. We swung our arms as much as we could and rolled him heavily into it. He sure didn't help much, I said, shocking myself again, but I was trying to make everyone feel better, to drag us back from madness a little. We stood there, looking at him. His body was all arms and legs now, a sprawling, broken doll, with his head tipped back at an awful, impossible angle. Without a word, Lee turned away and went into the bush and came back, towing a branch in each hand, which he then tossed over the soldier. Robin began to help him, then I joined them. We spent 10 minutes throwing rocks and branches at the body. It wouldn't stop the smell, and it wouldn't stop the feral dogs and other carnivores, but we had hoped that if there was a search it wouldn't last more than a day or two. That seemed a reasonable hope. Soon we seemed to arrive at an agreement that we'd done enough. The grey amongst the trees was lightening quickly as the day spread into the bush. We stood there for a moment. It felt weird, like I didn't want to walk away without saying anything. I glanced at Robin, and although her eyes were open and her lips were moving, I felt certain that she was praying. Say it out loud, I urged her. She looked at me in surprise. I said it again. Say something out loud. I can't, she said. She wrinkled her brow for a minute, then said, God, look after him. Then after a pause she added in a strong voice, Amen. Amen, I said, and after a moment Lee said it too. As he looked back to the others, he said to Robin, "If you'd seen what I saw last night, you wouldn't be praying for any of them, and you wouldn't be wondering if we'd done the right thing. They're filth. They're vermin." I understood then why he'd pushed a knife in the soldier's chest, but I was still scared of him for having done it.